The smell of old paper and stale coffee has a way of clinging to your skin. For 10 years, that was my scent. While the world saw Abigail Hart as a literary prodigy, the voice of a generation, I was the man in the corner of the room, my fingers permanently stained with the ink of stories she would claim as her own. I remember the early days. We lived in a studio apartment so small the radiator hissed like a dying animal every time the wind blew. We shared a single desk. Back then it was our dream. I told her I didn't care about the fame. I just wanted her to be happy. I gave her my best ideas, my most beautiful metaphors, and my deepest heartaches. I poured them into her manuscripts until she became a star. But fame is a strange poison. It doesn't kill you, it just changes the way you see the person who saved your life. It was the night of her 10th anniversary in the industry. We were at a gala in a ballroom that smelled of expensive lilies and pretension. Abigail stood on the stage, wearing a gown that cost more than our first 3 years of rent combined. She was beautiful, radiant, and utterly unreachable. "I owe my success to my intuition," she told the crowd, her voice smooth and practiced, "to the fire that burns within me. Writing is a lonely path, but I have always walked it with a fierce independence." I stood near the buffet table holding a glass of water, watching her. She didn't look at me once, not even when the crowd erupted in applause. She had begun to believe her own lies. She had forgotten the nights I stayed up until 4 a.m. fixing her plot holes while she slept peacefully, dreaming of the very applause she was now receiving. That was when Caspian appeared. He was her new literary agent, a man who looked like he was carved out of granite and ego. He slid up to her on the stage, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh, a light, airy sound she used to save only for me. "Who's the guy by the water?" I heard a critic ask nearby. "Oh, that's just Elias, Abigail's husband. He's a bit of a homebody, reclusive. I think he handles her schedules or something. Honestly, he's lucky she's so loyal. He doesn't really bring much to the table, does he?" I didn't feel anger. I felt a sudden, sharp coldness. It was the clarity I had read about in books but never felt. The fog of 10 years of sacrifice began to lift, and for the first time I saw Abigail for who she had become, a masterpiece I had painted, who now looked down on the artist for having paint on his hands. When we got home, the silence in the car was heavier than the darkness outside. Abigail didn't speak until we were inside our sprawling glass-walled house, a house built on the royalties of her books. "Elias," she said, tossing her clutch onto the marble island. She didn't look at me. She was looking at her reflection in the darkened window. "Elias." "The future?" I asked, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "Caspian thinks, and I agree, that my brand needs a shift. I'm moving into high society circles now. I'm being invited to speak at world summits. And you're always just here. You look tired, Elias. You look drained. You don't fit the vision of where I'm going." I leaned against the doorframe. "And where is it that you're going, Abigail?" "To the top," she said, finally turning to face me. Her eyes were hard. "And I want someone beside me who inspires me, someone with fire. Caspian understands the industry. He understands me. I think we should end this. I want a divorce." She waited for me to cry. She waited for me to remind her that I wrote every single word that made her famous. She waited for me to beg. Instead, I just looked at the desk in the corner of the room, the desk where the manuscript for her next book, the one the publishers were calling her career-defining work, sat half-finished. "Okay," I said. She blinked, her composure cracking for a split second. "Okay? Just okay? If you feel I am a shadow that dims your light, Abigail, then I will leave. I wish you and Caspian the very best." A person who is used to being the sun forgets that even the brightest star is surrounded by a darkness that gives it its shape. I didn't wait for the morning. I packed my laptop, my journals, and a few clothes. I didn't take the expensive watches or the designer suits she had bought me for public events. I took only what was mine. As I walked toward the door, she stood in the hallway looking at me with a mixture of confusion and triumph. She thought she had won. She thought she was finally free from the man who reminded her of her humble beginnings. "What about the new book?" she called out as I reached the handle. "I'm an ordinary man with no fire, remember?" I said with a faint, sad smile. "I'm sure a visionary like Caspian can help you finish it. After all, it's your intuition that writes the stories." I closed the door. I didn't slam it. I closed it softly, the click of the lock echoing in the quiet night. I drove until the city lights were a blur in my rearview mirror. I checked into a small motel by the coast. For the first time in 10 years, my hands were clean. No ink, no coffee stains, just the quiet, terrifying freedom of a man who has reclaimed his soul. I opened my laptop, not to write for her, but to delete the cloud sync to her devices. In one click, the last 10 chapters of her masterpiece, the chapters I had finished only hours before the gala, vanished from her computer forever. The voice of a generation was about to find out how quiet the world gets when the person behind the curtain stops speaking. The coastal town of Oakhaven didn't care about bestseller lists or literary awards. Here, the only thing that mattered was the tide and the weather. I rented a small cottage that smelled of salt and cedar. It was a far cry from the glass and steel prison I had shared with Abigail. My days were no longer dictated by her deadlines or her creative moods. I woke up when the sun hit the floorboards, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't reach for a pen to write someone else's thoughts. I spent my mornings walking along the shore. The rhythm of the waves felt like a heartbeat, a steady, honest thing. Back in the city, the voice of a generation was starting to crack. 3 days after I left, Abigail finally realized what I had done. I was sitting in a small local cafe sipping tea when my phone buzzed. It was a text from her. No "how are you," no apology, just 4 words. "Where are the files?" I didn't reply. I watched a seagull fight the wind. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Caspian. I answered it just to hear the sound of a man who realized he had bought a gold-plated statue that was hollow inside. "Elias," Caspian's voice was slick, but there was a tremor of panic underneath. "We're having a technical glitch over here. The cloud sync for the final chapters of The Silent Echo seems to have wiped. Abigail says you were the last one to access the server. We need the backup." "There is no backup, Caspian," I said. My voice was as calm as the morning mist. "What do you mean there's no backup? This is a $10 million contract. The publishers are expecting the final draft by Friday. She's a bit stressed. She needs her words back." "That's the thing, Caspian. Those weren't her words. They were mine. And when I walked out the door, I took my property with me. If Abigail is the unmatched genius you told the press she was, I'm sure she can recreate those chapters in an afternoon. After all, you told me she didn't need a shadow like me anymore." The silence on the other end was heavy. I could almost hear his brain trying to find a business-speak way out of this. "Listen, Elias," he said, dropping the slick tone. "Don't be petty. You're hurting her career. You're hurting the luminary of the literary world. Just send the files and we can discuss a settlement." "I don't want your money, Caspian.
I already paid my dues in 10 years of silence. I hung up. A week later, the rumors started. In the high-end literary circles where Abigail and Caspian now moved, image was everything. They had spent months positioning Abigail as a creative powerhouse who didn't need anyone's help. But a powerhouse needs fuel. Abigail sat in her home office, the one I decorated for her. She stared at the screen. The cursor blinked, a steady rhythmic taunt. Click, click, click. She tried to write. She typed out a sentence, then deleted it. She tried to remember how I used to describe the way rain felt on a window pane, or the specific way a character's heart would break, but the words wouldn't come. She had spent so long letting me be her soul that she had forgotten how to feel for herself. Caspian paced behind her, smelling of expensive cologne and desperation. "Just write something, Abigail, anything," he snapped. "We have the launch party booked at the Pierre Hotel. The critics are expecting a masterpiece. You're an icon. You're a literary force. Just do what you do." Abigail looked at him, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "I can't, Caspian. I don't know where the story goes. Elias always knew the ending." "Elias was a ghost," Caspian shouted, throwing his hands up. "He was a boring technical man who handled the chores. You are the star. Now act like it." But a star without a core is just a dying light.
The first sign of the disaster came during a live radio interview. Abigail was supposed to talk about the inspiration for her new book. "So, Abigail," the interviewer asked, "the teaser for The Silent Echo mentions a profound theme of sacrifice. What was the exact moment that sparked that idea for you?" There was a long, agonizing silence. On the radio, 5 seconds of silence feels like an eternity. It was a feeling," Abigail stammered. Her voice sounded thin, devoid of the confidence she usually wore like armor. "A sense of loss. It's hard to put into words." "But words are your gift," the interviewer pressed, slightly confused. "Your fans say you have a way of capturing the human soul like no one else. Can you give us a sneak peek, maybe a line from the final chapter?" Abigail's mind went blank. She thought of me. She thought of the way I used to whisper lines of poetry to her in the middle of the night so she could write them down and call them hers. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. I'm not feeling well." She walked out of the studio. The headlines the next day were brutal. "Is the voice of a generation losing her echo?" I read the news on my laptop while sitting on my porch in Oak Haven. I felt a twinge of sadness, but it was quickly replaced by a profound sense of justice. You can't expect the garden to bloom when you've poisoned the gardener who tended it in secret. That evening, a black SUV pulled up to my small cottage. Caspian stepped out, looking out of place in his $1,000 loafers on the gravel driveway. He didn't look like a powerhouse agent anymore. He looked like a man who was about to lose his biggest commission. "Elias," he said, walking up to the porch. He didn't wait for an invitation. "Enough of this. Name your price. Abigail is falling apart. The publishers are threatening to sue for the advance. We need those 10 chapters." I stood up, dusting the sand off my jeans. "You didn't come here for the chapters, Caspian. You came here because you realized that you can't sell a genius who doesn't have a brain." "Watch your mouth," he hissed. "She's the most important writer in the country." "No," I said, stepping closer. "She was a woman I loved, and you were the man who convinced her that she was too good for the person who made her. You wanted the icon. Well, you have her. Enjoy the silence." I turned to walk back into my house. "She's coming here, you know," Caspian yelled at my back. "She's desperate, Elias. She'll do anything to save her reputation." I paused at the door.
Then tell her to bring a pen. It's time she learned how to write her own story. The fog in Oakhaven doesn't just sit on the water, it crawls. It creeps into the cracks of the houses and settles in your lungs. It was on one of these gray, heavy mornings that I saw her car, a sleek silver European model that looked like a jagged tooth against the rugged coastline. Abigail didn't come with Caspian this time. She came alone. She stepped out of the car, and for a moment I didn't recognize her. The creative powerhouse who had graced the covers of magazines was gone. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and the dark circles under her eyes weren't hidden by expensive concealer. She looked like a woman who had been haunted by her own silence. I didn't get up from my porch chair. I just watched her walk up the gravel path, the sound of her heels clicking unevenly. "Elias," she said. Her voice was thin, like parchment paper. "Abigail," I replied. I didn't offer her a seat. I didn't offer her tea. I had spent 10 years anticipating her every need, and I was finally out of practice. She stood at the edge of the porch, looking out at the ocean. "It's quiet here," she whispered. "Too quiet. It makes it hard to think." "No," I said, softly. "It makes it hard to hide. There's a difference." She turned to me, her eyes filling with tears that didn't feel like the practiced stage crying she used at book signings. This was real. This was the panic of a woman who had realized she was standing on air. "The publisher sent a legal notice this morning," she said, her voice trembling. "They want the manuscript, Elias. They've seen the sneak peek Caspian tried to fake using AI, and they hated it. They said it lacked heart. They said it sounded like a machine trying to pretend it had a soul." She laughed, a jagged, broken sound. "I sat at my desk for 18 hours yesterday. I stared at the screen until my eyes bled. And you know what I wrote? Nothing. I wrote, 'The sun rose,' and I deleted it because I didn't know how to make the sun matter. You were the one who made the sun matter, Elias." I leaned back, the wood of the chair creaking under my weight. "I didn't make the sun matter, Abigail. I just wrote what I felt. The problem is, you've spent so long pretending to be an icon that you forgot how to feel anything that wasn't for an audience." She crossed the porch and knelt beside my chair, her hand reaching out to touch my arm. It was the same gesture she used to use when she wanted me to stay up all night to finish a chapter for her. "Please," she sobbed, "I'll give you everything. I'll give you the house, the royalties, the credit. We can tell the world you're my co-author. We can say it was a collaborative miracle. Just give me the ending of the book. Don't let me fall like this. Don't let Caspian be right about me." I looked down at her hand. Once that touch would have moved mountains. Now it felt like nothing more than a ghost of a memory. "You're still worried about Caspian?" I asked, a faint smile touching my lips. "The man you chose because he was a force of nature? The man who was supposed to take you to the top?" "He doesn't care about me," she cried. "He only cares about the brand. He's already looking for a new prodigy to represent. He told me that if I don't deliver this book, I'm literary dead weight." I gently moved my arm away, breaking her grip. "He's right about one thing, Abigail. Without the heart, the body is just weight. But you didn't just lose the heart of the book, you lost the man who gave it to you." I stood up and walked into the house, returning a moment later with a single leather-bound notebook. Her eyes lit up with a desperate, hungry flame. She thought it was the ending. She thought her salvation was in my hands. "Is that it?" she whispered. "No," I said. I opened the notebook to the first page. It was filled with my handwriting, not the complex, layered prose I wrote for her, but something raw, something honest. It was a story about a man who lived in a shadow and finally found the sun. "I've started my own book, Abigail," I said, "under my own name. It's not about an unmatched genius or a high society scandal. It's about the silence of a decade. And it's the best thing I've ever written." The look on her face wasn't just sadness, it was the realization that the shadow had outshined the star. She saw that I wasn't just the help, I was the source. "You're going to publish it?" she asked, her voice hollow, "While I lose everything?" "I'm not doing it to hurt you, Abigail. I'm doing it because for 10 years I gave you my voice. I think it's time I used it for myself." The most dangerous person to betray is the one who stayed silent while you took everything, because they are the only ones who know exactly how much you have to lose. She stood up, wiping her face with the back of her hand. The desperation was starting to turn into a cold, bitter resentment, the last defense of a dying ego. "You think they'll want you?" she spat, her voice hardening. "You're a nobody, Elias. Without my face on the cover, your words are just ink on paper. People want the luminary. They want the Abigail Hart magic. They don't want a middle-aged man from a fishing village." I looked at her, and for the first time I felt nothing but pity. "Maybe you're right," I said. "Maybe the world only wants the lie. But at least when I go to sleep tonight, I'll know who wrote the words on my page. Can you say the same?" She didn't answer. She turned and walked back to her silver car, her heels crunching in the gravel like breaking bones. She drove away, the engine roaring as she sped back toward the city, back to Caspian, back to the empty house, and back to the blank screen that was waiting to devour her. I sat back down in my chair. The fog was lifting, revealing a clear blue horizon. I picked up my pen. I didn't think about Abigail. I didn't think about the publishers. I just thought about the next word. The Pierre Hotel was a cathedral of gold leaf and velvet. For the launch of The Silent Echo, Caspian had spared no expense. He believed that if the stage was grand enough, no one would notice that the actor had forgotten her lines. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sharp ozone-like sting of paparazzi flashes. Every major critic, every creative titan of the industry, and every socialite in the city was there. They were all waiting for the unmatched genius to reveal her latest soul-stirring masterpiece. In the dressing room, Abigail stared at her reflection. She was wearing a dress the color of midnight, but her face was as pale as ash. Beside her, Caspian was adjusting his tie, his reflection looking hungry and sharp. "You have the speech, Abigail," Caspian said, his voice a low hiss. "The ending we composed. It's fine, it's dramatic, it's what the people want. Just read it with that soulful look you do, and the check will clear by morning." "It's not fine, Caspian," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's empty. It's just words. There's no blood in it. Elias always made the words bleed." Caspian grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip tight enough to leave bruises through the silk. "Elias is a ghost. He's gone. You are the brand. Now get out there and sell the lie." The applause was deafening as Abigail walked onto the stage. The spotlights were blinding, creating a wall of white that hid the faces of the audience. To Abigail, it felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. She began to read the final chapter, the one Caspian had hired a team of high-speed ghostwriters to assemble in a week. At first, the audience was silent. They were used to being moved by her. They were waiting for that specific Abigail Hart magic, the way a sentence could make you feel like your own heart was being dissected. But as she read, the silence changed. It wasn't the silence of awe, it was the silence of confusion. The words were perfect in a technical sense, the grammar was flawless, the vocabulary was sophisticated, but it was cold. It lacked the hidden rhythm, the subtle ache that had defined her previous work. It sounded like a symphony played by a computer. Abigail's voice faltered. She looked at a line about a shattered heart, and she realized she didn't know why the character's heart was shattered. Elias knew. Elias had lived that line. She was just a mouth moving over dead ink. When she finished, the applause was polite, not the thunderous roar she was accustomed to. Then came the Q&A. A veteran critic named Alistair Galvez stood up. He had been Abigail's biggest champion since her first book. He looked at her through his spectacles, his expression troubled. "Abigail," he began, his voice echoing in the hall, "I've read your work for a decade. Your prose usually has a haunted quality. It feels like someone is whispering a secret directly into my ear. But this ending, it feels different. It feels like a statement rather than a confession. Tell me, the metaphor you used on page 342 about the architecture of silence, what were you feeling when you designed that image?" The room went still. Abigail looked at Caspian in the wings. He was gesturing for her to speak, to use her intuition. Abigail opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She didn't know what the architecture of silence meant. She had read the words for the first time 2 hours ago. That metaphor was one Elias had written in a notebook years ago while watching her sleep. I wanted to convey the weight of things unsaid," she stammered. "But the sentence concludes that silence is a foundation, not a weight," Galvez pressed, his eyes narrowing. "It's almost as if the person who wrote that sentence and the person explaining it are two different people." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The grand illusion was beginning to dissolve. The cameras, once her friends, now felt like thousands of accusing eyes. While Abigail was drowning in the light of the Pierre Hotel, I was sitting in a quiet library in Oakhaven. I didn't need to watch the live stream. I knew the ending they had written wouldn't work. You can't fake a soul, no matter how much you pay for the packaging. I received an email that evening. It was from a small, prestigious publishing house, the kind that cared more about the ink than the icon. They had read the first 50 pages of my own manuscript, the one I had written under the name Elias McNeil, using my mother's maiden name to keep the distance. "Mr. McNeil," the email read, "we haven't seen prose like this in years. It has a raw, devastating honesty that feels like a ghost come to life. We want to publish this as our lead title for the autumn." I closed the laptop and looked out at the moon reflecting on the black water of the bay. For 10 years, I had been the foundation of her silence. I had built her empire brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, and she thought the empire belonged to her because her name was on the gate. A crown can be stolen and a throne can be bought, but the light that makes a king comes from within. When you cast out the person who carried your torch, don't be surprised when you're left stumbling in the dark. The morning reviews were a bloodbath. "The Echo is empty," the Sunday Times headline screamed. "Abigail Hart delivers a soulless conclusion to a legendary career." The social media backlash was even worse. Readers began comparing the new book to their old ones, pointing out the shift in soul. The unmatched genius was being called a fraud. Caspian didn't call her to comfort her. He called her to tell her that the merger he had planned with a major film studio was dead. He told her she was radioactive. Abigail sat in her empty house, the divorce papers still on the marble island where I had left them. She picked up a pen. She tried, one last time, to write a letter to the editor, to explain, to defend herself. She wrote, "I am Abigail Hart. I am the voice." And then she stopped. She looked at the words. They looked like strangers. She realized with a soul-crushing finality that she wasn't the voice. She was just the megaphone, and the person speaking into it had walked away.
Autumn in the city feels like a long goodbye. The leaves turn into brittle gold, and the air carries a sharpness that reminds you that nothing stays green forever. I was back in the city for the first time in 6 months. I wasn't there as a husband, a shadow, or a ghost. I was there as E.A. McNeil. My book, The Shadow and the Sun, had been out for 3 weeks. It hadn't just been a success, it had been a cultural earthquake. The critics who had once praised Abigail were now using my work to explain why her final book had failed so spectacularly. They called my prose hauntingly familiar, yet distilled into something purer. One reviewer wrote, "It feels as if we have finally been given the source of the river we have been drinking from for a decade." I was sitting in a quiet, independent bookstore, the kind of place Abigail would have found too small for her status. I was there for a private reading. No paparazzi, no flashes, just 20 people who loved the weight of a well-crafted sentence. Halfway through the reading, the door at the back of the shop creaked open. A woman walked in, keeping her head low, her face partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat and a scarf. She stayed in the back, leaning against a shelf of poetry, but I knew the way she stood. I knew the way she held her breath. It was Abigail. She had lost the house. I had heard through the grapevine that the publishers had successfully clawed back her advance, and Caspian, the man she thought was her creative titan, had moved on to a young poet in London, leaving Abigail to handle the lawsuits alone. She was living in a small apartment in a part of town she used to mock. I finished reading the final passage, a section about a man who finally realizes that the sun doesn't need a mirror to be bright. The room stayed silent for a long moment before the small crowd erupted in a warm, genuine applause. As the guests began to filter out, Abigail remained. She waited until the bookstore owner went to the back to make tea. Then she stepped into the light of the reading lamp. "It was always you," she whispered. She held a copy of my book in her hands. It was dog-eared and marked with ink. "I read it 3 times. I recognize the way you describe the morning light. I recognize the way you talk about loneliness. This is what everyone loved about me. It was never me. It was you." I stood up and began to pack my fountain pen into its leather case. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I thought I would. I just felt a profound sense of peace. "It was us, Abigail," I said softly. "In the beginning, it was us, but you decided that the us wasn't enough for the world you wanted to inhabit. You wanted to be a luminary, so you turned the person who gave you your light into a secret." "I'm bankrupt, Elias," she said, a tear tracing a path through the dust of her makeup. "The lawyers, the taxes, everything is gone. Caspian won't even take my calls. He told the press that I misled him about my process." She looked at me with a spark of the old desperation. If you tell the world you wrote the old books too, we could fix this. We could do a rebranding. People love a comeback story. We could be the most powerful couple in the industry again." I looked at her, truly looked at her, and I realized that she still didn't understand. Even at rock bottom, she was looking for a brand instead of a soul. She was still trying to find a way to use my voice to power her megaphone. "I don't want to be powerful, Abigail," I said. "I just want to be honest." "But I have nothing," she cried, her voice echoing in the small shop. "I have no career, no money, no husband. I don't even have my own words." "You have exactly what you chose. You chose the image over the substance. You chose the force of nature over the man who kept you grounded. You wanted the light. Well, this is what it's like to stand in it alone." I picked up my coat and walked toward the door. As I passed her, she reached out and grabbed my sleeve. "Will you ever forgive me?" she whispered. I paused, looking at her hand on my arm.
I already have, Abigail. I forgave you the moment I realized that hating you was just another way of being tied to you. I'm not tied to you anymore. I walked out of the bookstore into the crisp autumn night. The city hummed around me, a million stories happening all at once. For the first time in 10 years, I wasn't wondering which one I should write for someone else. I checked my watch. I had a train to catch. Back to Oakhaven. Back to the salt air and the quiet cottage. Back to the life where I didn't have to be a ghost. As I walked toward the station, I saw a billboard for a new luxury watch. The slogan read, "Own the moment." I smiled to myself. People spend their whole lives trying to own moments, trying to build empires out of shadows and glass. But the only thing you truly own is the truth of who you are when the lights go out. A man who walks in his own light can never be lost in the dark, but a person who steals the fire of another will eventually find themselves shivering in the cold of their own making.
The train pulled out of the station, the rhythmic clack-clack of the tracks acting as a metronome for my thoughts. I opened my notebook to a blank page. I didn't think about Abigail's downfall. I didn't think about Caspian's betrayal. I thought about the way the moon looked as it rose over the coast and how it didn't matter if anyone was watching it. It was beautiful because it was true. I pressed the pen to the paper. Chapter 1, I wrote, and for the first time in my life, the words were mine alone. Epilogue. Abigail Hart's name faded from the shelves within a few years, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of sudden fame. But E.A. McNeill became a staple of libraries across the world. People often asked him in interviews why he never did television appearances or gala events. He would always give the same calm, knowing smile and say, "I spent 10 years being seen and not heard. I find I much prefer being heard and not seen." Because in the end, the loudest thing in the world isn't a shout. It's the silence of a man who finally knows his own value.
Thank you for sharing this chapter with us at Velvet Chapters Brew. Comment, like, and subscribe to see where the next page takes us.